2NURFM.com, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
We're joined this morning by Associate Professor Wayne Reynolds, who is a historian and from the University of Newcastle's Faculty of Humanities and Social Science. And we've been taking a broader look at the history of groups like ISIL, ISIS, Daesh, and the fact that they do have this parcel of land that they now control in the Levant. And Wayne, we were just mentioning the idea of a caliphate. Perhaps you might care to just explain that for people. Again, we hear it on the news, but sometimes it's not as clear as it needs to be by definition. What is it?
Well, it's a state that combines all of the elements of government that in the West we've seen mostly separated, so church and state. Well,
we call it the separation of powers.
Separation of powers, although in recent times I'm not so sure everybody in the West has done that. But the political, the religious, the military, they're all sort of part of the state. But even within caliphates, while you have a sultan or Ayatollah Khomeini in the case of Iran, you've usually got a secular structure within it as well. Someone's got to fight and organise the Republican Guard. For example, in the Ottoman Caliphate, the palace guard were Christians, the Janissarides. So you had within the structure, you still have the military.
Right.
You still have these structures, but the supreme leader is religious, and they are the supreme leader in the state.
So have we managed to identify, is there a supreme leader? I mean, I suppose everyone could point to Osama bin Laden at one point as being the leader of Al-Qaeda and that terrorist outfit. Is there never seems to be a name in relation. Is there a supreme leader for ISIS and the Caliphate and the Levant? Is that...
Yeah, it was al-Baghdadi claimed that status in 2013.
Okay.
And the whole idea was that, he became the leader in 2010. And when this thing joined across the borders after the fighting in Syria in 2011-12, al-Baghdadi became the leader. And he's now the supreme leader. But as I've said, a lot of the actual organisation within ISIL goes back 30 years.
Okay.
So you've really got to separate out what, on the one hand, is an appeal to religious enthusiasm and rising up. And there's a long precedent for this. In World War I, for example, one of the first things the Turks did was call for an uprising within the British Empire, particularly the Muslim subjects in what becomes Pakistan and in Egypt. So there was this call, but the Grand Mufti led that in Constantinople, but above that was the Sultan. So you still had your traditional armies and what have you of the Ottomans, but there was this appeal to enlist the idea of an uprising. In fact, the Ottomans had been working with this sort of model of using religion to rise up against enemy empires at the beginning of the 20th century.
So this is, we're saying on one hand there are new methods in terms of propaganda, but it really is an old concept of using it, and we know that there have been many wars fought on religious basis across history.
That's right, Meryl. And if you actually look at Turkey as an example, the young Turks, the military officers who got behind Kemal Ataturk that gave you a secular Turkey after World War I, they were the ones that hit upon the idea, particularly in the province of Libya, of using religious loyalties of the tribesmen to rise up against their enemies. So it was not just a group that believed in Sharia law and couldn't see the military significance of using subject minorities to do that.
Yes.
And I think this is a complexity in the Middle East, and it goes back, if you want to go back to the origin of this division between those who are fighting based on religion and a more organised resistance. You can see it after 1967 when Nasser led a coalition of Arab states, and he thought we can extinguish Israel in that war. It was a blockade. The Israelis struck very quickly and destroyed the armies of Egypt, Syria and Jordan. And at that point, a lot of people were saying, well, we can't actually extinguish Israel. This is not going to work with conventional forces. Sadat tried one last shot in 1973, initially successful, but that too was defeated. And then you start getting people like George Habash inside the Palestine Liberation Organisation setting up a movement very similar to the sort of approach that ISIL has. Targeted assassinations, political, Al-Qaeda type approaches. But on the other hand, within the State of Israel, you had this concept of the Intifada,
Yes.
where people are what we would call self-radicalised, people who will pick up a knife. And this gets to the point about the suburbs. How do you know that somebody, either through social media today or looking at what was happening with the loss of territory, the loss of homes, being expelled and going into refugee camps and what have you, how do you know that somebody's just not going to pull out a knife? And you're seeing this now in Israel. So it's the Intifada concept. So you've got two very distinctive forms of terrorism here.
Yeah. Yes. So how does this then? How do we tie that back to Paris and Sydney and any number of suburbs across the world in relation to? Can this, and I don't want to use the term, can this force be defeated? But what is the way forward, in your opinion, Professor Wayne Reynolds, to find a solution, peace? On one hand, is it, as the French seem to be going down the track of, we will just defeat them now at any cost? Or is it about dialogue? Is there anyone to talk to? That's why I was asking if there was a supreme leader. Is there anyone to actually go into dialogue with? What do you see as the way forward?
Well, there's no one answer.
No.
And there's no short-term fix. It's been a long-term problem and it's going to take a long-term solution. You get suggestions that, well, we need a political fix. But even now you've got some calling out for the removal of the leader of Syria, even though Turnbull has, in my view, quite rightly said, well, you've got to be pragmatic. You're going to have to sit around the table and try to work out the overarching strategic issues in the Middle East. So what I'm saying, Meryl, is that this is at three levels, really. It's at the strategic level in the Middle East, and it goes to questions such as, well, what about the West Bank? What about the Gaza Strip, which is under blockade quite illegally? What about those situations? What about the state of Palestine? You can't just go on vetoing any proposal when in 1948 the proposal was to have a two-state solution. So that's always going to cause a slow burn with people. On the other hand, if you come down to the next level, well, what do whole societies do with social media and countering the narrative? Well, you've got to have a narrative. You've got to have a narrative. But I think it's difficult when you're not making any traction on the overarching issues in the Middle East. So it's about Israel, it's about Sunni versus Shiite and all the other groups. But you've also got the question of, OK, what are you going to do in Western societies? There are roughly 5,000 people from Western societies who have gone to fight in Syria. So that's raising questions such as, well, what are you going to do with youth, young people that are self-radicalising?
Exactly.
What sorts of issues are in place to and that brings you down to the micro level. What do you do when there's a student, a 15-year-old, that self-radicalises, and that comes down to teachers, counsellors. As Jacques Chirac said in 2004, French president, that said, I need to understand the problem in France. France on fire, we've got a problem. He said, I can put 10,000 troops on the streets, but I've got 1 million teachers.
Yes, exactly. Wayne Reynolds, this is an ongoing conversation, but I do thank you for your time today. And as you say, it's all of our jobs to a certain extent to try and understand this and do what we can at a local community level. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
Associate Professor Wayne Reynolds from the University of Newcastle. It's 2NURFM.